April 15, 1945. The island of Okinawa trembled beneath an artillery barrage that had not ceased for 72 hours. In a cave system carved into the limestone cliffs near Shuri, 23 civilian women pressed themselves against the damp walls, their ears ringing from explosions that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. They had been told for months what would happen if the Americans came. The warnings had been specific, detailed, and terrifying, but what these women were about to experience would shatter every belief they had been taught to hold as absolute truth. Their encounter with soldiers from the American forces would reveal a humanity they had been assured did not exist, and the simple act of receiving water from hands they expected to harm them would forever change their understanding of the conflict that had consumed the Pacific. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how 23 Japanese women, prepared for the worst fate imaginable, instead discovered that the greatest weapon against hatred is not force, but the unshakable dignity of human kindness. Kimiko Yamashita was 31 years old when the American forces landed on Okinawa. A schoolteacher from Naha, she had spent the previous 3 months helping to organize civilian defense efforts, which in practice meant preparing women and children for what military authorities called the final sacrifice. The instructions had been clear and consistent since March. Military representatives had visited every neighborhood, every school, every community gathering place with the same message. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka of the 32nd Army had stood in the courtyard of Kimiko's school on March 23rd and addressed the assembled teachers and older students. His uniform was crisp despite the humidity, his posture rigid with military bearing. Kimiko remembered every word of his speech because she had been required to transcribe it and post copies throughout the school. "The American forces are not human in the way we understand humanity," Captain Tanaka had said. His voice carried across the courtyard without need for amplification. "They are particularly barbaric toward women and children. If capture becomes inevitable, it is your duty to choose honor over the unspeakable degradation that awaits you. The military has provided grenades for this purpose." 2 seconds after pulling the pin. Remember this. 2 seconds is enough time to hold your children close. Kimiko had written these words in her careful script, her hand steady despite the trembling she felt inside. She posted the notices as required. She distributed the grenades to families who requested them, each one wrapped in cloth, each one accompanied by precise instructions. She did all of this because she believed it was her duty, and because she had been assured by every authority she trusted that this information was factual and necessary. The propaganda campaign had been comprehensive and psychologically sophisticated. It began in January, when rumors of an impending American invasion reached Okinawa. Local military authorities held assemblies in every town and village, showing photographs they claimed were from other Pacific islands where American forces had already landed. The photographs depicted destruction and devastation, with captions describing atrocities that may or may not have occurred. There was no way for civilians to verify these claims, no independent sources of information to consult. By early April, as American forces pushed deeper into Okinawa, Kimiko found herself responsible for a group of 22 other women who had fled to the cave system near Shuri. The youngest was Sachiko Nakamura, barely 16, a student Kimiko had taught 2 years earlier. The oldest was grandmother Taniguchi, 74, who moved slowly but whose mind remained sharp, and whose memories stretched back to the Meiji era. The women had carried with them what they could when they fled their homes: rice wrapped in cloth, photographs of family members, letters from husbands and sons serving in the military, and grenades. Each woman had at least one, some had 2. They kept them close, wrapped carefully, a terrible insurance policy against a fate they believed would be worse than death. Among the women in the cave was Yuki Matsumoto, 28 years old, a nurse who had worked at the Naha civilian hospital until it was destroyed in early April. Yuki had medical training, which made her invaluable to the group, but she carried a burden heavier than her nursing skills could address. She had been present at a military briefing in March, where detailed instructions were given to medical personnel about what to do if their facilities were overrun. The briefing had been conducted by a medical officer, a doctor who wore a military uniform but whose credentials suggested extensive civilian medical experience. He had explained, with the same clinical detachment Yuki used when discussing treatments with patients, that medical personnel had a special responsibility to ensure civilians did not fall into enemy hands alive. "You understand human physiology better than most," the medical officer had said. "You know which methods are quickest and cause the least suffering. If your facility is about to be captured, your duty is clear. Assist those in your care to choose honor. Children first, as they will understand the least and fear the most. Then the elderly and injured. Medical personnel should be the last, after ensuring everyone else has been properly attended to." Yuki had taken notes during this briefing, her hand moving automatically across the page, even as her mind recoiled from what she was hearing. She had become a nurse to save lives, to heal the sick and comfort the dying. Now she was being instructed to facilitate mass casualties based on the assumption that any fate was preferable to capture by American forces. When the hospital was destroyed, and Yuki fled to the caves with whatever supplies she could carry, she brought those notes with her. They represented official instructions from a credentialed medical authority. How could she question them? How could she know better than a doctor with years of experience and official sanction from military command? Another woman in the cave was Haruko Oshiro, 35 years old, mother of 3 children who were not with her. Her husband served in the 32nd Army, and she had not heard from him since February. Her children had been evacuated to relatives in a northern part of the island weeks earlier, and Haruko did not know if they had survived the bombardment that had ravaged so much of Okinawa. Haruko carried with her a letter from her husband, written in January before communications became impossible. In it, he had addressed the possibility of American invasion and what she should do if he did not return. His words were loving but firm, reflecting the same propaganda that saturated every aspect of Okinawan society in the months leading up to the invasion. "My dearest Haruko," he had written, "if the Americans come and I am not there to protect you, remember what we discussed. Our family's honor is more important than individual survival. Choose the path that allows you to meet our ancestors with dignity. I will wait for you on the other side, proud of your courage. Tell the children I loved them, and that their father died knowing his family understood what honor requires." Haruko had read this letter dozens of times in the weeks since fleeing to the caves. Each reading reinforced her resolve to follow her husband's instructions, to choose the option he had endorsed, to demonstrate the courage he expected from her. She carried a grenade specifically acquired for this purpose, and she had mentally rehearsed the actions she would need to take when the moment came. Lieutenant James Morrison of the 96th Infantry Division had grown up in Chicago, the son of a postal worker and a seamstress. He was 24 years old and had been in the Pacific Theater for 11 months. He had seen combat on Leyte and had earned a Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded men from a burning vehicle under fire. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for the psychological warfare tactics that Japanese military authorities had used on their own civilian population. Morrison commanded a platoon of 42 men, 28 of whom were black soldiers from the segregated units that made up a significant portion of American forces in the Pacific. The platoon's composition reflected the complex racial dynamics of the American military during this period. Black soldiers served in segregated units, often assigned to support roles or labor details rather than combat positions. But the demands of the Pacific Campaign had necessitated their deployment in more varied capacities. Sergeant William Hayes, Morrison's second-in-command, was a former schoolteacher from Alabama who had joined the Army in 1942, despite knowing he would face discrimination from his own side as well as the enemy. Hayes was 38 years old, older than most enlisted men, and his maturity and education made him a natural leader among the men in the platoon. Hayes had taught history at a segregated high school in Birmingham before the conflict. He understood propaganda and psychological manipulation from both academic study and personal experience. Growing up in the segregated South, he had observed how false narratives about racial superiority were maintained through selective information, controlled narratives, and the systematic exclusion of contradictory evidence. This understanding would prove crucial in his interactions with Okinawan civilians. On the morning of April 15th, Morrison's platoon was tasked with clearing cave systems in the limestone ridges east of Shuri. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese forces were using the caves for ammunition storage and as concealed firing positions. What the intelligence did not mention was that hundreds of civilians had also taken shelter in these same caves, hiding from the bombardment that had turned much of Okinawa into a moonscape of craters and rubble. Private First Class Robert Johnson was the first to hear the voices. Johnson, 22, from Detroit, had worked in his father's automotive shop before the military. He had an ear for engines and machinery, an ability to diagnose problems by sound alone. But the sound that stopped him as he approached the entrance to the cave system was distinctly human, high-pitched, fearful. The sound of women's voices raised in what might have been prayer or farewell. Johnson had 3 sisters back in Detroit. The youngest, Marie, was 16, the same age as some of the voices he was hearing from the cave. The thought of Marie in a situation like this, frightened and believing she was about to die, made Johnson's chest tighten with a protective instinct that transcended nationality or military allegiance. "Lieutenant Morrison," Johnson called out, keeping his voice low. "We've got civilians in there. Women, I think. Sounds like maybe 24 or more. Sir, they sound terrified." Morrison moved forward carefully. The entrance to the cave was partially obscured by vegetation, a natural concealment that had probably saved the occupants from being spotted during aerial reconnaissance. He could hear the voices now too, a rhythmic cadence that reminded him of the prayers he had heard in churches back home, that same desperate reaching for divine protection in the face of overwhelming fear. As Morrison listened more closely, he could make out individual voices within the collective prayer. Some were higher, younger, perhaps teenagers. Others were deeper, more mature. He could hear crying, the kind of sobbing that comes from utter despair, and underneath it all a rhythmic chanting that sounded like preparation for something final and irrevocable. Sergeant Hayes joined them at the cave entrance. The 3 men stood silent for a moment, listening. Hayes had seen this before on Leyte, civilians who had been told such horrific stories about American soldiers that they chose to leap from cliffs rather than surrender. The military called them suicides, but Hayes knew they were murders, psychological killings carried out with words instead of weapons. "We need to get them out of there safely," Morrison said. "No sudden moves, no aggressive postures. Hayes, get the interpreter up here, and tell the men to lower their weapons. We're not going to give these people any reason to be more frightened than they already are. I want every man to understand that our mission right now is not clearing this cave system. It's saving lives. Make sure they all get that message." Hayes moved through the platoon, speaking quietly to each soldier, explaining the situation and the approach Morrison wanted to take. Most of the men responded with nods of understanding. They had all heard stories of civilian casualties, of people choosing death over capture based on propaganda and misinformation. Many of the black soldiers, in particular, understood what it meant to be dehumanized through systematic lies and distortions. Private James Washington, the platoon medic from Georgia, immediately began organizing medical supplies. He pulled out bandages, water purification tablets, basic antibiotics, and the limited pain medication available to field medics. He understood that medical care would be part of demonstrating peaceful intentions, that treating injuries and illness would communicate benevolence more effectively than words alone. Inside the cave, Kimiko could hear movement outside the entrance, American voices, speaking in that strange language that sounded harsh and incomprehensible to her ears. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the grenade she had carried for 6 weeks. Around her, other women were doing the same. Some were crying, some had their eyes closed in prayer. Sachiko, the 16-year-old, was gripping Kimiko's arm with both hands, her fingernails digging into skin. "Sensei," Sachiko whispered, using the term of respect for teacher. "I am frightened. Will it hurt?" Kimiko wanted to tell her student that it would be quick, painless, that they would simply cease to exist in the flash of an instant, but she could not speak past the tightness in her throat. She had taught Sachiko mathematics and literature. She had encouraged the girl's love of poetry, and now she was expected to help her die because men in positions of authority had declared this to be honorable and necessary. Yuki Matsumoto, the nurse, moved among the women with her medical training, suppressing her own fear in favor of practical concerns. She checked to make sure everyone understood how to use their grenades properly. She reminded them to hold the explosives close to their bodies to ensure the outcome would be certain. She did all of this with professional detachment, the same manner she had used when preparing patients for difficult procedures. But inside, Yuki felt a growing dissonance between her training as a healer and the role she was now playing. Every instinct developed through years of nursing told her to preserve life, to find ways to extend survival, to never give up on a patient who still drew breath. Yet here she was, facilitating preparations for mass casualties based on assumptions about what Americans would do. Assumptions she had no way to verify from her own experience. Grandmother Taniguchi spoke from her position against the cave wall. Her voice carried the weight of 7 decades of life, of experiences that spanned from the age of samurai to the age of total conflict. "I remember when the Westerners first came to Japan," she said, "before the Meiji Restoration, when my grandmother was young. There were stories then too, warnings about the barbarians from across the sea. Some of those stories were true, many were not." "What are you saying, grandmother?" Haruko Oshiro asked, clutching the letter from her husband. Her voice carried an edge of desperation. "My husband told me what we should do. The military authorities confirmed it. How can you suggest they might be wrong?" Grandmother Taniguchi shifted her position slightly, her old bones protesting the dampness of the cave. "I am saying that I have lived long enough to see how fear can be used as a weapon more powerful than any gun. I am saying that we should perhaps wait to see if the reality matches what we have been told before we make a decision that cannot be undone. I am saying that in my 74 years, I have learned that those who benefit from our fear are not always truthful about the things they want us to be afraid of." "But the captain said," Kimiko began, her voice trailing off as she realized she was about to cite authority rather than evidence, command rather than reason. "The captain is not here," Grandmother Taniguchi interrupted gently. "We are. And I think we should see for ourselves what kind of men these are before we decide they are monsters. If I am wrong, we still have our grenades. We can still make the choice we were told to make. But if I am right, if the Americans are not what we were told, then using these explosives would be the greatest tragedy of all. We would die not from necessity, but from lies." This argument created a moment of hesitation among the women. The logic was compelling, even if it contradicted everything they had been told. If they used the grenades immediately, they would never know whether the warnings were accurate. But if they waited, observed, gathered their own evidence, they could make an informed choice rather than acting on second-hand information. Reiko, the woman with the 4-month-old baby, spoke up. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I want to see them for myself. I want to know if these men would really harm my daughter the way we were told. If I am going to make a choice that affects her life, I want it to be based on what I see with my own eyes, not what someone else told me I would see." Outside the cave, Corporal David Chen had arrived with his language skills. Chen was 3rd-generation Japanese-American from California, a fact that had made him simultaneously invaluable and suspect to the military authorities. He had spent the first year of the conflict in an internment camp before being recruited for translation services. His Japanese was fluent, though his accent marked him as American-born. Chen's journey to this cave on Okinawa had been complex and painful. His family's produce business in Sacramento had been confiscated when they were interned in 1942. His father, a man who had lived in America for 40 years and considered himself fully American, had died in the internment camp from pneumonia exacerbated by inadequate medical care. Chen's mother and siblings remained in the camp, while he served as a translator for the very government that had imprisoned his family. But Chen had made peace with this complexity by focusing on what he could control. He could not change the injustice of internment. He could not bring back his father, but he could use his language skills to prevent unnecessary casualties, to bridge the communication gap between American forces and Japanese civilians, to save lives that might otherwise be lost to mutual incomprehension and fear. Morrison explained the situation. "Chen, I need you to tell them we mean no harm. We need them to come out peacefully. Tell them we have water, medical supplies, and food. Tell them we will not hurt them. Tell them they are safe with us." Chen stepped closer to the cave entrance, close enough to be heard clearly, but not so close as to appear threatening. He called out in Japanese, his voice carefully modulated to sound calm and reassuring. "My name is David Chen. I am a translator for the American forces. We know you are in the cave. We know you are frightened. We are not here to harm you. We have water and food. We have medical personnel who can help anyone who is injured or ill. Please come out slowly, with your hands visible, so we can see you mean us no harm, and we can show you we mean you no harm." He paused, then added something that came from his own experience rather than Morrison's instructions. "I know you have been told terrible things about what will happen if Americans find you. I know you have been given instructions to harm yourselves rather than be captured. I am telling you that those instructions were based on lies. Please, give us a chance to prove through our actions that we are not the monsters you were told about." Inside the cave, the sound of fluent Japanese from outside the entrance caused a ripple of confusion. Kimiko exchanged glances with the other women. This was not what they had expected. They had been told the Americans would storm the cave, that there would be violence and brutality. Instead, there was a voice speaking their language, offering water and safety, acknowledging the propaganda they had been subjected to. "It is a trick," one woman hissed. Her name was Keiko, and she was 33 years old, a shopkeeper's wife whose husband had been conscripted 8 months earlier. "They want us to surrender, so they can do to us what the captain warned about. They send someone who speaks our language to make us trust them, but it is all deception." Grandmother Taniguchi struggled to her feet, using the cave wall for support. "Then I will go first," she said. "I am old. I have lived my life. If they are going to do what we fear, better it happens to me than to the young ones. But if they are telling the truth about the water, then I would very much like a drink before I die. My mouth feels like it is filled with dust, and I am tired of being afraid." "Sensei, you cannot," Sachiko protested, reaching for the old woman's arm. "If something happens to you, we will not forgive ourselves." But Grandmother Taniguchi was already moving toward the cave entrance, her slow shuffle echoing in the confined space. "If something happens to me," she said over her shoulder, "then you will know the truth and can make your choices accordingly. But if nothing happens to me, if these Americans give me water and treat me kindly, then you will also know the truth. Either way, we will have real information instead of fearful assumptions." Kimiko watched her go, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The grenade in her hand felt heavier than it should, a concentrated weight of finality and terrible choice. Around her, the other women were frozen, watching to see what would happen to the elderly woman who had chosen to test the truth of what they had been told. The old woman appeared at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of the cave. She raised her hands slowly, palms out, a gesture of both surrender and supplication. Outside, Morrison's men had their weapons lowered as ordered, pointed at the ground rather than at the elderly woman who stood blinking in the sunlight. Sergeant Hayes stepped forward. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of manual labor before the military. His skin was dark, darker than Grandmother Taniguchi had ever seen on a human being. She stared at him with unconcealed curiosity. This man who looked so different from anyone she had encountered in her 74 years. Hayes understood that his appearance might be particularly frightening to someone who had been subjected to propaganda that specifically targeted black soldiers as especially savage. He had heard the stories, knew how Japanese military authorities had used racial fears to intensify the terror civilians felt toward American forces. He moved slowly, deliberately, making his intentions clear through his body language. He reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap with movements that were deliberately slow and visible. He took a drink himself first, a gesture meant to show the water was safe, not poisoned or contaminated. Then he held the canteen out to Grandmother Taniguchi, extending it at arm's length so she could take it without coming too close to him if she preferred. For a long moment, the old woman simply stared at the offered canteen. This was not supposed to happen. This gentle offering of water from a man she had been taught to fear, this basic human kindness from someone she had been assured was incapable of such gestures. This contradiction of everything she had been told for months. Her hand shook as she reached for the canteen. Hayes noticed the trembling and stepped closer, supporting the bottom of the canteen with his other hand so she would not drop it. The water was cool, cleaner than anything Grandmother Taniguchi had tasted in weeks. She drank deeply, feeling the liquid ease the terrible dryness in her throat, wash away the dust and fear that had accumulated over long days in the cave. "Thank you," she said in Japanese, her voice barely above a whisper. The words came automatically, the courtesy that had been ingrained in her since childhood, the basic acknowledgement of kindness received. Chen translated, and Hayes nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "You are welcome, ma'am," he said, and Chen translated this as well. "Would you like more water? We have plenty, and you look like you have not had enough to drink in quite some time." Grandmother Taniguchi nodded, and Hayes allowed her to drink more from the canteen. As she drank, other members of the platoon moved into position, not threateningly, but in a way that showed organization and readiness to assist. Private Washington, the medic, approached with his medical bag, signaling through gestures that he wanted to examine the elderly woman to see if she needed medical attention. Inside the cave, the women had heard Grandmother Taniguchi's words of thanks. They heard no screams, no sounds of violence, nothing but the quiet exchange of basic human courtesy. Kimiko felt something shift inside her, a crack in the absolute certainty she had carried for months. Perhaps, she thought, we have been lied to. Perhaps everything we were told was designed not to protect us, but to ensure we would never have the opportunity to discover that our supposed enemies were actually human beings capable of basic decency. She stood up, still holding the grenade, but no longer with the intention of using it. Around her, the other women were rising as well, some slowly, some with visible reluctance, but all of them moving toward the cave entrance, toward the light, toward the possibility that they might survive this day after all. Yuki Matsumoto, the nurse, was among the first to follow Grandmother Taniguchi. Her medical training made her curious about the medic she could see outside the cave, interested in how American medical personnel might differ from Japanese nurses in their approach to patient care. She emerged from the cave with her hands raised, her nurse's bag visible on her shoulder, a signal that she was medical personnel rather than a combatant. They emerged one by one, blinking in the brightness, their clothes dirty from weeks in the cave, their faces showing the strain of fear and hunger and sleepless nights. Morrison's men maintained their non-threatening postures, weapons down, hands visible, movements slow and deliberate. Private Johnson had grown up with sisters, 3 of them, and he recognized in these emerging women the same protective instinct he felt toward his own family. He reached for his canteen, following Hayes's example, taking a drink himself first before offering it to the nearest woman. She was young, maybe 17 or 18, with eyes that looked far older than her years. The young woman hesitated, then accepted the canteen. Like Grandmother Taniguchi before her, she drank deeply, the water almost painful in its coolness against her parched throat. When she finished, she returned the canteen with a small bow, an automatic gesture of courtesy that survived even in these circumstances. One by one, Morrison's men shared their water with the emerging women. Canteen after canteen was offered, accepted, drained, returned. The simple act of sharing water, this most basic of human necessities, became a bridge across the chasm of fear and propaganda that had separated these people. Private Thomas Wright from Philadelphia noticed a young woman emerging with an infant. The baby was clearly malnourished, its cries weak and irregular. Wright immediately called for Washington, the medic, and between them they assessed the infant's condition. The baby was severely dehydrated and showing early signs of starvation. Washington prepared a diluted sugar water solution, showing the mother how to give small amounts at regular intervals to avoid overwhelming the child's stressed system. Reiko, the baby's mother, watched with desperate attention as the American medic tended to her daughter. She had been prepared to end both their lives, rather than face what she believed awaited them in American captivity. Now she was watching a foreign soldier, someone who should have been her enemy, working with focused intensity to save her child's life. Washington spoke to Chen, who translated for Reiko. "Your daughter needs proper medical care, nutrients we do not have in the field. We will make sure she gets to a medical facility where she can be properly treated. You will go with her, of course, you will not be separated, But right now, the most important thing is to keep giving her small amounts of this solution at regular intervals. Can you do that? Reiko nodded, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear this time, but tears of overwhelming relief and gratitude. Yes, she said through Chen's translation. Yes, I can do that. Thank you for saving my daughter. Kimiko was among the last to emerge. She stepped into the sunlight, still carrying the grenade, now wrapped again in its cloth. She saw Grandmother Taniguchi sitting on a rock, looking more peaceful than she had in months. She saw Sachiko accepting a ration bar from a young American soldier who was demonstrating through gestures how to open the wrapper. She saw Reiko cradling her baby while the American medic checked the infant's vital signs with gentle hands. Lieutenant Morrison approached Kimiko, and Chen translated his words. We need you to surrender any weapons or explosives you may be carrying. We understand you may have grenades. Please place them on the ground carefully, and my men will collect them and dispose of them safely. You will not be harmed. You have my word as an officer, and I want you to understand that my word means something to me. I take it seriously. Kimiko looked at the wrapped grenade in her hands, this object that had represented her last choice, her final act of control over her own fate. She had carried it for 6 weeks, never more than an arm's length away. She had slept with it beside her pillow. She had imagined, countless times, the moment when she would pull the pin and embrace the oblivion she had been told was preferable to capture. Now, looking at the faces of these American soldiers, seeing the genuine concern in their expressions, hearing the careful courtesy in their translated words, she realized that everything she had been told was a lie. Not a misunderstanding or an exaggeration, but a deliberate, calculated lie designed to ensure that she would choose death over the possibility of revealing to the world that these supposed monsters were actually human beings capable of compassion. She unwrapped the grenade and placed it gently on the ground. Around her, the other women were doing the same. 23 grenades, each one a potential tragedy averted, each one a life saved from a death that had never been necessary. The collection of those grenades took almost an hour. Morrison's men handled each one with extreme care, understanding that some might be unstable after weeks of storage in damp conditions. They placed them in a secure container, marked for later disposal by ordnance specialists. As they worked, other members of the platoon distributed water, food rations, and basic medical supplies to the women. Corporal James Washington, the medic from Georgia, examined Grandmother Taniguchi's swollen ankles and provided bandages and ointment for the sores that had developed from sleeping on the damp cave floor. He worked with gentle efficiency, his hands careful and professional, explaining through Chen what he was doing and why. Your circulation has been impaired by remaining in one position for too long, Washington explained, as Chen translated. These ointments will help with the inflammation, and I am going to wrap your ankles to provide support. You should try to move around more once we get you to a safer location. Keep the blood flowing properly. But for now, this should provide some relief. Grandmother Taniguchi watched the medic work, observing how carefully he touched her elderly skin, how he checked repeatedly to make sure the bandages were not too tight, how he seemed genuinely concerned about her comfort and well-being. This man, whose skin was so different from hers, who spoke a language she did not understand, was treating her with more consideration and respect than she had received from the military authorities, who shared her nationality and language. Private First Class Thomas Wright gave his own jacket to Reiko to wrap around her baby daughter, who was shivering despite the warmth of the day. The infant was severely dehydrated, and Wright stayed with Reiko as she gave the baby small sips of the solution Washington had prepared, showing her how much was safe to give at one time, his expression worried and focused. These acts of basic human decency, multiplied across the platoon, created a scene that would have been unthinkable to the women just hours before. American soldiers, many of them black men they had been taught to fear as particularly savage, were treating them with a kindness and respect that exceeded what they had experienced from their own military authorities. Sachiko sat next to Kimiko as they shared a ration bar, the young girl's eyes wide with something that might have been wonder or shock or perhaps just the beginning of understanding. "Sensei," she said quietly, "they are not what we were told they would be. The captain said they would be like animals, that they would show no mercy, that death would be better than falling into their hands. But look at them. They are giving us their own food, their own water, their own jackets. They are treating Grandmother Taniguchi's injuries and helping Reiko's baby. These are not the actions of monsters. No, Kimiko agreed, her voice heavy with the weight of realization. They are not. And that means we have been lied to about everything, about why we are fighting, about what will happen if we lose, about who our enemies really are. All of it lies, designed to keep us compliant and willing to sacrifice ourselves for goals that were never explained to us honestly. Haruko Oshiro, the woman whose husband had written her instructions to choose honor over capture, sat apart from the others, staring at the letter she still clutched in her hand. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Her husband, whom she loved and trusted, had told her one thing. The military authorities, whom she had been taught to respect and obey, had confirmed it. But her own eyes, her own experience, were showing her something completely different. Private Marcus Thompson from Chicago noticed Haruko's isolation and her distress. Through Chen, he asked if she was injured or ill, if there was anything he could do to help. Haruko looked up at this young man, barely older than 20, with genuine concern in his eyes, and felt something break inside her. "My husband told me you would be monsters," she said through Chen's translation, holding up the letter. "He told me to choose death rather than encounter you. The military gave me a grenade specifically for that purpose. But you are not monsters. You are young men far from home, and you are being kind to us even though we are your enemies. I do not understand how everything I believed could be so wrong." Thompson listened to the translation, his expression thoughtful. "Ma'am," he said slowly, giving Chen time to translate. "I cannot speak for your husband or your military authorities, but I can tell you that we were told things about you too. We were told that all Japanese soldiers would fight to the death, that civilians would be hostile and dangerous, that we could not trust anyone. Some of that has been true, some of it has not. What I have learned is that in conflict, everyone is lied to. Both sides use fear and propaganda to keep their people fighting. The truth is usually much more complicated and much more human than either side wants to admit." Grandmother Taniguchi overheard this exchange and added her own observation. "In my 74 years, I have learned that those who wish to control you through fear will always tell you that the alternative to obedience is something too terrible to contemplate. They told us death was preferable to capture because they knew that if we were captured and treated well, their lies would be exposed. They needed us to die to protect their narrative of superiority and justified aggression." "Is that why they gave us the grenades?" another woman asked. Her name was Fumiko, and she was a teacher like Kimiko, though she taught younger children, not to protect us, but to protect their story, to ensure we could never testify to the truth of how we were treated. Grandmother Taniguchi nodded slowly. "I believe that is exactly why. Dead people cannot contradict the official narrative. But we are alive, and we have seen the truth, and that makes us dangerous to those who built their power on lies." Lieutenant Morrison arranged for the women to be transported to a civilian relocation center that had been established by American forces for displaced Okinawan residents. The center was located in a relatively intact school building in Kadena, far from the active combat zones. Before they left, Morrison spoke to the group through Chen, wanting them to understand what would happen next. "You will be taken to a safe location, where you will have shelter, food, and medical care. You are not prisoners. You are civilians caught in a conflict zone, and our responsibility is to ensure your safety and well-being. If you have family members you wish to locate, we will help you do so when it becomes possible. You have already endured too much. We will not add to your suffering. I want you to know that the way we have treated you today is not exceptional or unusual. This is how we are trained to treat civilians, with respect and basic human decency." Chen translated these words carefully, and Kimiko listened with an attention she had never given to military proclamations from her own side. There was no bombast in Morrison's speech, no appeals to honor or duty, and no threats or warnings, just a straightforward explanation of what would happen and a commitment to basic human welfare. The transport trucks arrived an hour later. As the women climbed aboard, many of them turned back to look at the soldiers who had saved their lives through the simple act of treating them like human beings. Some bowed, some smiled tentatively, Some just stared, still processing what had happened, still coming to terms with the enormous gap between expectation and reality. Sergeant Hayes stood with Morrison as they watched the trucks pull away. The sergeant had been quiet for most of the interaction, letting the lieutenant and the other men take the lead. Now, with the women gone, he spoke what was on his mind. "Sir, I've been thinking about something. Those women were ready to end their own lives because they believed we would do worse to them if they didn't. The people who told them that, the ones who gave them grenades and instructions on how to use them, those people are the real enemy here. Not because they shoot at us, but because they're willing to sacrifice their own people to maintain their power and their narrative. That is a particular kind of evil that goes beyond normal military operations." Morrison nodded. "It is a particular kind of evil to convince people that death is preferable to the possibility of encountering human decency from those designated as enemies, and the tragedy is that this won't be the last time we encounter civilians who have been programmed to fear us more than they fear oblivion. We are going to see this again and again, and each time we are going to have to prove through our actions that the propaganda was false." Over the next 3 months, as American forces continued operations on Okinawa, Morrison's platoon encountered 14 more groups of civilians hiding in caves and other fortified positions. The pattern was consistent and heartbreaking. Each group had been given similar warnings about American brutality. Many had grenades or other means of ending their lives. And each time, the patient application of basic human kindness, the offering of water and food and medical care, the careful demonstration of peaceful intentions, managed to overcome the conditioning of fear. By late June, Morrison estimated that his platoon alone had safely evacuated over 300 civilian residents of Okinawa who might otherwise have chosen the final option they believed was honorable and necessary. Other units reported similar experiences. The psychological warfare tactics employed by military authorities against their own population had been extensive and effective, but they had not accounted for the possibility that American forces would respond with compassion rather than the brutality that had been predicted. Kimiko Yamashita spent 3 months at the Civilian Relocation Center in Kadena. During that time, she worked as a translator and liaison, helping other evacuated civilians adjust to their circumstances and understand that they were safe. She wrote detailed letters to military authorities describing her experiences, documenting the deliberate campaign of misinformation that had led so many civilians to prepare for self-destruction. Her testimony, along with that of hundreds of other civilians, would later be used in post-conflict analyses to understand the full scope of the psychological operations that had targeted the civilian population. Military historians would spend years documenting how authorities had weaponized fear and cultural concepts of honor to encourage civilian casualties, creating a situation where people chose death over the possibility of humane treatment. Yuki Matsumoto, the nurse, found work at the civilian medical facility established by American forces in Kadena. She worked alongside American medical personnel, learning their techniques and approaches to patient care. She was struck by how differently American medics approached civilian casualties compared to the instructions she had received from her own military medical authorities. Where Japanese military medicine had emphasized efficiency and triage that often meant abandoning those deemed unlikely to survive, American field medicine emphasized saving every life possible. Medics like Washington spent hours treating civilians who would have been classified as non-priority cases under Japanese military medical protocols. This difference in approach revealed fundamentally different attitudes toward the value of individual human life. In August of 1945, when the conflict ended following the atomic bombings and the declaration of peace, Kimiko returned to what remained of Naha. Her school was destroyed, reduced to rubble by bombardment, but she found materials to create a new school, teaching in a converted warehouse with salvaged desks and makeshift supplies. She never forgot the lesson she learned in that cave system near Shuri about the power of propaganda and the courage required to question absolute certainties. The first lesson she taught in her makeshift classroom addressed what her students had been told during the conflict and what had actually happened. She described her own experience, the propaganda she had believed, the grenades she had carried, and the moment when reality contradicted everything she had been taught to accept as truth. We were told that Americans were monsters, Kimiko explained to her students, many of whom had lost family members during the conflict. We were told that death was preferable to capture. We were given weapons and instructions for how to use them on ourselves. And all of it was a lie, designed not to protect us, but to ensure we could never testify to the truth of how we were actually treated. This is the first and most important lesson I can teach you. Authority figures can lie. Systems of power can be built on falsehood. Your responsibility as educated citizens is to question, to seek evidence, to test claims against reality rather than accepting them on faith. Sachiko Nakamura, the 16-year-old student, went on to become a journalist in post-conflict Japan. She specialized in investigating and exposing misinformation, dedicating her career to ensuring that future generations would have the critical thinking skills necessary to question narratives designed to manipulate through fear. In interviews later in life, she always credited her survival and her career choice to that moment when Grandmother Taniguchi chose to test the truth of what they had been told, rather than accept it as absolute. I learned from Grandmother Taniguchi that courage is not always about fighting, Sachiko said in a 1980 interview. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is question what everyone tells you is certain truth. She risked her life to test whether the Americans were really the monsters we had been told they were. That act of questioning, of demanding evidence rather than accepting fear-based propaganda, saved 23 lives that day. It also taught me the importance of independent verification and critical thinking in journalism. Grandmother Taniguchi herself lived until 1963, reaching the age of 92. In her final years, she gave numerous interviews to historians and researchers, describing in detail the propaganda campaign that had targeted Okinawan civilians and the moment when an American sergeant had offered her water instead of violence. She became a voice for reconciliation and understanding, arguing that the greatest victory over hatred was not achieved through force, but through the persistent application of human decency. In one of her last interviews, conducted in 1962 when she was 91, Grandmother Taniguchi reflected on the broader implications of what had happened in that cave near Shuri. "I have thought about that day every day for 17 years, she said. I have asked myself what would have happened if I had not challenged the group to test the truth of what we were told. 23 women and 1 baby would have died unnecessarily. 23 families would have been destroyed by lies, and the truth about how Americans actually treated civilians would have been buried under one more tragedy. But more than that," she continued, "I have thought about how many other caves there were, how many other groups of civilians who did not have someone willing to question the propaganda. How many people died because everyone in their group accepted the lies as truth. We will never know the full count of lives lost to psychological manipulation rather than actual military necessity. That is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, that we cannot even properly number the dead who were killed by words rather than weapons." Lieutenant James Morrison returned to Chicago after the conflict ended. He completed his college education using benefits provided to returning service members and became a social worker, dedicating his career to helping veterans and refugees adapt to new circumstances. He rarely spoke about his military service, but he kept a photograph of his platoon taken on Okinawa in 1945, a reminder of the day when basic human kindness proved more powerful than months of psychological conditioning. When his own children asked him about his service in the Pacific, Morrison would tell them about the cave near Shuri and the women who emerged expecting to die. He used the story to teach his children about the power of propaganda and the importance of treating all people with fundamental human dignity, regardless of what they had been told about them. "The most important thing I learned in the conflict," Morrison would tell his children, was that propaganda works both ways. We were told things about the Japanese that were not always accurate. They were told things about us that were definitely not accurate. Both sides used fear and dehumanization to maintain support for the fighting. The antidote to this mutual dehumanization was not more propaganda or more sophisticated psychological warfare. It was simple human kindness, consistently applied. Water offered to a thirsty person, medical care provided to someone in pain, Basic respect shown to people in vulnerable circumstances. These simple acts undermined years of propaganda in a matter of hours. Sergeant William Hayes returned to Alabama and resumed his teaching career. He taught history at a segregated high school, later at an integrated school after the civil rights movement achieved its victories. He told his students about Okinawa, about the women in the cave, about the power of treating people with dignity, regardless of what you have been told about them. Many of his students went on to become activists and organizers, carrying forward the lesson that compassion is a form of resistance against systems built on dehumanization. Hayes drew explicit connections between his experiences in Okinawa and the civil rights movement he witnessed in the decades after the conflict. The same psychological tactics used to convince Okinawan civilians that Americans were subhuman monsters were used in the South to convince white populations that black Americans were dangerous and inferior. The same appeals to fear and tradition, the same selective presentation of information, the same enforcement of narratives through authority and social pressure. The lesson from Okinawa, Hayes told his students, is that these narratives can be challenged and overcome through direct human contact and the demonstration of common humanity. Just as those women in the cave learned that Americans were not monsters by actually meeting Americans and receiving humane treatment, so too can people overcome racial prejudice through genuine human interaction that contradicts the stereotypes they have been taught. Private First Class Robert Johnson returned to Detroit and worked in the automotive industry, becoming a union organizer and advocate for workers' rights. He spoke at union meetings about his experiences in the Pacific, about how solidarity across differences was possible even in the most difficult circumstances. He argued that if American soldiers and Japanese civilians could find common humanity in a cave on Okinawa, then workers from different backgrounds could certainly find common cause in the factories of Detroit. Johnson's union organizing work drew heavily on the lessons he learned from that day in April 1945. He understood that management would try to divide workers along lines of race, ethnicity, and background, just as military propaganda had tried to divide civilians from soldiers, allies from enemies. The antidote was the same in both cases: direct human contact, mutual aid, and the demonstration through action that solidarity was more powerful than division. Corporal David Chen faced complicated circumstances upon returning to the United States. His service as a translator had been valuable, but he returned to a country that had incarcerated his family and community in camps during the conflict. He became an advocate for Japanese-American rights and reparations, using his experiences to argue that loyalty and patriotism could not be determined by ancestry. He testified before government committees, describing how he had helped save Japanese civilians from propaganda designed to ensure their deaths, even as his own government had questioned his loyalty based solely on his heritage. The 23 women who emerged from that cave near Shuri on April 15, 1945, went on to live complex and varied lives. Some emigrated to other countries. Some remained in Okinawa and helped rebuild their communities. Some married American servicemen and moved to the United States. All of them carried with them the memory of the day they learned that everything they had been taught about their enemies was a calculated lie. Haruko Oshiro eventually reconnected with her 3 children who had survived the conflict in the northern part of the island. Her husband did not return. He was confirmed to have died in combat in May 1945. Haruko spent years reconciling the man she had loved, who had written her those instructions to choose death over capture, with the reality of what would have happened if she had followed those instructions. She eventually came to understand that her husband had been as much a victim of propaganda as she had been, that his beliefs about American brutality were genuine even if they were false. In 1978, a reunion was organized for survivors of the Okinawa civilian evacuation operations. Kimiko Yamashita, now 64 years old and retired from teaching, attended with Sachiko Nakamura, who had become a prominent journalist. They met with several members of Morrison's platoon, including Sergeant Hayes, who was still teaching at age 77. The reunion was held at a community center in San Francisco, chosen for its accessibility to attendees from both Japan and various parts of the United States. Over 300 people attended, survivors and service members and their families, gathering to commemorate an aspect of the conflict that had received relatively little public attention compared to major battles and strategic operations. Kimiko spoke at the reunion, her English now fluent after decades of study and use. She stood at a podium, looking out at an audience that included both the women she had sheltered in that cave and the men who had offered them water instead of violence. "I have spent 33 years thinking about what happened on that day in April 1945, she said. "I have tried to understand how we could have been convinced that death was preferable to encountering these men who treated us with such basic human decency. And I have concluded that the answer lies in understanding how fear can be weaponized, how propaganda can replace reality in people's minds, how systems of power maintain themselves by ensuring that alternatives appear more terrifying than compliance." She paused, looking specifically at the section where Hayes and other members of Morrison's platoon were seated. "But I have also learned about the power of individual choice in the face of systematic dehumanization. These men could have treated us as the enemy. They could have responded to us with the same brutality we expected. Instead, they chose to see us as what we were, frightened women who had been lied to and manipulated. They chose compassion over conditioning, humanity over hatred. And in doing so, they saved 23 lives that day, and countless more in the weeks and months that followed as word spread that Americans were not the monsters we had been told they were." Sergeant Hayes spoke as well, his voice still strong despite his age. He talked about the responsibility that comes with power, about how the strongest demonstration of strength is often the choice to show mercy and compassion. He talked about his experiences as a black soldier in a segregated military, about understanding what it meant to be dehumanized and how that understanding had informed his interactions with civilians in Okinawa. "We knew what it was like to be told you were less than human," Hayes said. "We experienced that from our own country, our own military, every single day. So when we encountered people who had been told that we were monsters, we understood that this was a lie, designed to serve someone else's purposes, and we chose to prove through our actions that the lie was false, not because we were heroes, but because we were human beings who recognized other human beings in need of help." The reunion concluded with a ceremony where the women who had been evacuated presented a memorial plaque to the surviving members of Morrison's platoon. The plaque was inscribed with the names of all 42 men who had served in that unit, including those who had not survived to see the reunion. The inscription read in both English and Japanese, "To those who chose compassion over cruelty, who offered water instead of violence, who proved that humanity survives even in the darkest times, with gratitude and remembrance." The historical significance of what happened in those caves on Okinawa extended far beyond the immediate saving of lives. The documentation of the propaganda campaign targeting civilians became important evidence in understanding the full scope of psychological warfare tactics employed during the Pacific conflict. The testimony of survivors like Kimiko helped historians understand how civilian populations had been manipulated into choosing mass casualty scenarios, and how this manipulation reflected broader strategies of total mobilization. Military analysts studying the Okinawa operations noted that the successful evacuation of civilians through compassionate treatment had multiple strategic benefits. It reduced civilian casualties, which aligned with humanitarian objectives and international law obligations. It undermined enemy propaganda, making it easier to convince other civilian groups to surrender peacefully rather than choosing self-destruction. And it provided valuable intelligence as evacuated civilians shared information about military positions, tactics, and civilian conditions in occupied areas. But perhaps more importantly, the Okinawa evacuations demonstrated that even in the context of total conflict, individual actors could choose to behave with humanity and compassion in ways that transcended military objectives. The soldiers who offered water to frightened women were not disobeying orders or acting against military protocols. They were following the fundamental principle that civilians caught in conflict zones deserved protection and humane treatment, a principle that would later be more explicitly codified in international humanitarian law. This principle, demonstrated in caves throughout Okinawa in the spring and summer of 1945, would influence the development of the Geneva Convention's updates after the conflict ended. The specific protections for civilians in occupied territories, the requirements for humane treatment of non-combatants, the prohibitions against collective punishment and psychological warfare targeting civilian populations, all of these provisions were informed in part by the experiences documented on Okinawa. The legacy of those 23 women who emerged from the cave near Shuri extends into the present day. Their story is taught in schools in Japan and Okinawa as an example of how propaganda can be used to manipulate populations and how critical thinking is necessary to resist such manipulation. Peace education programs use their testimony to illustrate the human cost of militaristic ideologies that value loyalty and obedience over individual human life. In the United States, the story is less well known in popular culture, but has been incorporated into military training programs focused on civilian interaction in conflict zones. Service members learn about the Okinawa evacuations as examples of how patient, compassionate engagement can achieve objectives that force cannot accomplish. They study the techniques Morrison's platoon used, the importance of interpreters like Chen, the power of simple gestures like sharing water and providing medical care. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine and peacekeeping operations training explicitly reference the Okinawa civilian evacuation experiences as templates for best practices. The emphasis on demonstrating peaceful intentions through concrete actions, on building trust through consistent humane treatment, on understanding that civilians caught in conflict zones have often been subjected to propaganda about what to expect from foreign forces. All of these principles can be traced back to lessons learned in caves on Okinawa in 1945. The broader lesson of the Okinawa civilian evacuations is about the nature of dehumanization and the courage required to resist it at both individual and systemic levels. The Japanese military authorities, who gave grenades to civilians and told them that death was preferable to capture, were engaged in a form of psychological warfare that targeted their own people. They weaponized cultural concepts of honor and shame, they exploited legitimate fears of occupation and violence, and they created a situation where people genuinely believed that ending their own lives was the right and necessary choice. But they did not account for the possibility that their enemies might refuse to play the role assigned to them in this narrative. They did not anticipate that American soldiers, particularly black soldiers who understood dehumanization from personal experience, would respond to frightened civilians with compassion rather than cruelty. They did not foresee that simple acts of human kindness, the offering of water and food and medical care, could undermine months of propaganda in a matter of hours. This failure of imagination on the part of military authorities reveals a fundamental weakness in systems built on dehumanization and propaganda. Such systems assume that everyone will behave according to the roles assigned to them. They cannot accommodate the possibility that individuals will choose humanity over hatred, compassion over conditioning. When confronted with such choices, when people encounter direct evidence that contradicts the propaganda they have been fed, the entire edifice of manipulation can collapse with surprising speed. The women who emerged from that cave carried with them a truth that no amount of propaganda could erase. They had direct personal experience of being treated with dignity and respect by people they had been taught to fear. They could testify to the gap between what they had been told and what they had experienced, and their testimony, multiplied across hundreds of similar encounters throughout Okinawa, helped to undermine the narratives that had justified the conflict and prepared the ground for eventual reconciliation and peace. Today, the cave system near Shuri, where Kimiko Yamashita and 22 other women waited for death that never came, is part of a peace memorial park. A marker at the site describes what happened there in April 1945, the propaganda that had convinced civilians to prepare for mass casualties, and the American soldiers who chose compassion over cruelty. Visitors to the site can read the testimonies of survivors, view photographs of the reunion held in 1978, and reflect on the lessons this history offers for the present. The memorial includes a small fountain where water flows continuously, a symbolic reference to the canteens shared on that April day. The inscription beside the fountain quotes grandmother Taniguchi from one of her final interviews, given in 1962. Water is the most basic necessity of life, and sharing it is the most basic act of human kindness. On the day I expected to die, a soldier whose skin was darker than any I had ever seen offered me water from his own canteen. In that moment, I understood that the divisions between peoples are created by those who benefit from separation, and that our common humanity is stronger than any propaganda designed to deny it. Educational programs bring students to the memorial to learn about this history. They study the propaganda techniques used to manipulate civilian populations during the conflict. They discuss the responsibility of individuals to question narratives that dehumanize others. They consider what it means to choose compassion in circumstances where cruelty would be easier or more expected. And they learn about the long-term consequences of these choices, how individual acts of kindness can ripple across decades and generations, influencing not just the immediate recipients, but entire communities and societies. The story of the 23 women and the soldiers who offered them water has become a parable for the power of human connection to overcome systematic attempts at dehumanization. It demonstrates that no amount of propaganda can completely erase the capacity for compassion, that individuals can choose to behave with humanity even when systems encourage brutality, and that these individual choices can have profound and lasting impacts that extend far beyond the immediate moment. But the story also carries a warning about the ease with which populations can be manipulated through fear and the deliberate distortion of information. The women in that cave were not ignorant or gullible. They were educated, thoughtful people who had been subjected to months of consistent messaging from every authority they trusted. Kimiko was a teacher, Yuki was a nurse, Haruko was a loving mother, following instructions from her beloved husband. The fact that they believed what they were told, that they prepared to act on those beliefs, demonstrates how vulnerable all populations are to propaganda when it is applied systematically and reinforced through multiple channels. This vulnerability has not decreased in the decades since Okinawa. If anything, modern communication technologies have made it easier to spread misinformation and more difficult to verify truth through independent sources. The lessons of Okinawa, the importance of questioning narratives designed to inspire fear and hatred, the necessity of seeking direct experience over second-hand claims, the value of critical thinking and independent verification remain as relevant today as they were in April 1945. The 23 women who emerged from that cave near Shuri became witnesses to a fundamental truth about human nature and social systems. They learned through direct experience that compassion is possible even in the worst circumstances, that individuals can choose humanity over hatred, that simple acts of kindness can undermine complex systems of propaganda. They carried this knowledge with them for the rest of their lives, sharing it with children and grandchildren, with students and communities, with anyone who would listen to their testimony. And their testimony, combined with that of the soldiers who offered them water, creates a record of a moment when everything could have gone differently. A moment when people could have died unnecessarily, when fear could have triumphed over hope, when the worst predictions of propaganda could have become self-fulfilling reality. But instead, because individual people made individual choices to behave with compassion and dignity, life prevailed over death, humanity over hatred, truth over propaganda. This is the legacy of April 15, 1945, in a cave system near Shuri on the island of Okinawa. Not a military victory or a strategic triumph, but a simple human moment when frightened women received water from soldiers they expected to harm them, and in that exchange learned that the greatest weapon against dehumanization is the persistent, stubborn insistence on treating others with basic human decency, regardless of what you have been told about them, regardless of what role they are supposed to play in your narrative of conflict and fear. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.